Now the high forehand volley is one of the most common ways recreational players mess up at the net. And what I see is that players will hit the high forehand volley like an overhead. So they will take a full swing at the high forehand volley. They will treat it just like an overhead. Now an overhead is a full swing, very similar to the service motion. And players will attempt to do a movement like this when the ball is lower. It looks something like this. They will do a full overhead on a lower ball. And there are several problems when players attempt to do this. First of all, you have to understand that this movement does require some time. And when the ball is higher, we have time to execute a movement like this. Often when the ball is lower, you're not going to have enough time to execute a looping swing where the racket drops down and then comes back up, and you end up speeding everything up, and it's often a rushed movement. If you ever see a player attempt to hit an overhead when the ball is too low, it always looks hectic like this, simply because there's not enough time to execute the overhead. Also, the overhead requires a full extension of the arm, where we simply cannot achieve that when the ball is too low, and players often look cramped, and as a result of it, they will miss the ball into the net because the trajectory is not there, but also they will mistime the ball, frame it, resulting in wild mistakes. So what should you do instead on a forehand volley, especially when we're talking about high forehand volleys? Well, you have to keep the wrist stable. This is very important when we're talking about the forehand volley, because what happens to a lot of players, independent of the height of the ball, they snap the wrist on the forehand volley. This is only a problem on the backhand when we're talking about high volleys, not so much on low volleys. Naturally, the wrist is in a more natural position on a lower backhand volley. However, on the forehand, players have this temptation to straighten out the wrist. And this is not only true on a lower forehand volley, but especially on a high forehand volley. So another mistake, if you will, on a high forehand volley is that players will snap their wrist, or like I already mentioned, they will attempt to hit an overhead. So what should you do instead? Well, you have to keep the wrist extended through the entirety of the stroke. And now, depending on your proximity to the net, you can either hit straight down on the ball, Bryan Brothers style. They used to get very close to the net and put balls away like this. This is definitely a technique that you can utilize if you're close to the net. However, the further away from the net you are, the less likely you are going to make the ball go over the net if you hit straight down on it. So what should you do instead? Well, you have to keep the racket parallel to the net and then swing from high to low. And it looks something like this. You're going to get a high forehand volley. You're going to maintain the extended angle of the wrist and go from a high position to a low position. This is going to give you the best chances to get the proper downward trajectory with a great chance of making the ball over the net. And most importantly, when that wrist is extended through the entirety of the shot, you're going to get a clean contact and avoid wild mistakes.